Having considered what should happen within the school setting, there are then some considerations about what should happen across schools and settings, especially those that are linked through clusters. So some key things here: professional dialogue between schools for the purpose of developing a shared understanding of progression should also be a continuous process that takes account of the full breadth of curriculum. It should build upon the professional dialogue that has taken place within schools and should enable schools to learn from each other. And I think one of the important statements here is across the full breadth of the curriculum. Previously, we've done quite a lot of work in terms of moderation, in terms of sharing information in core subject areas, or what we previously called core subjects. Now there's a requirement for us to think about that across the full breadth of the curriculum, and not just in terms of curricular considerations, which I'll come to shortly. Schools must work with their cluster to put appropriate arrangement processes in place to support this. With each school participating on an equal basis, the cluster should work together to establish the most effective ways of working. So again, whilst this has happened previously, and this has often been about moderation of work, particularly around year 6 between primary and secondary, for example, this needs to be a much broader conversation now across a greater breadth of the curriculum. And schools should belong to at least one other group in addition to their cluster for the purpose of developing a shared understanding of progression. So for secondary schools here, there is an expectation that they're a member of a group which has at least another secondary school within its membership, so that they can start looking across areas of learning, perhaps at developing their understanding of progression, and pupil progress through this framework. In the next section of the guidance, it talks about professional dialogue involving funded non-maintained settings. And here there's a clear signal that that providers of funded non-maintained nursery education should become members of the group whose remit is to develop a shared understanding of progression and to participate in the full professional dialogue that takes part of this process, so that all settings can develop a common understanding of progression across this 3 to 16 continuum. So I think that's an important thing to note. And in terms of the input to support professional dialogue, perhaps previously when we've looked at moderation and we've looked at transition, one of the things that we haven't looked at is a broad range of evidence and a broad range of different pieces of information to support a better understanding of progression. So one of the things that signal quite clearly here is there could be a range of inputs into this process. So examples of curriculum planning, examples of classroom planning, examples of learning and teaching activities, so that we can start thinking about pedagogies and approaches, example of learning both processes and outcomes, so not just looking at the evidence of the work or the books, but actually the processes that led to those outcomes. And again, the pedagogical approaches that have been taken, and then examples of additional support provided. So if a learner made a particular level of progress, what support was provided in order to ensure that they could make that level of progress? And to what extent were pupils independent in doing some of that work? So all of those things could be considered as part of that dialogue. In the next section, it talks about the role of various actors in the process. So it talks here about how learners should be engaged in the process, but it also then talks about local authorities and regions and what they should be doing. So it's quite clear that what regions will need to do is support this professional dialogue in terms of understanding progression, but clearly this should be supportive, build on the practice already established, and not be anything to do with external accountability, but to look at where practice is good and help to share and disseminate that across the region. The next section of the guidance focuses around transition along the 3 to 16 continuum, and again there are some key messages in here I think that it's worth highlighting. The first one really is this one that I've highlighted on the screen. Head teachers and governing bodies should ensure that transition arrangements are considered when school curriculum are designed and planned. This includes developing and embedding a robust and effective process for transition of learners across the 3 to 16 continuum. So again, reinforcing the points that we made above in terms of not just perhaps focusing on 1 or 2 areas, but thinking more broadly about that learner's progress across the continuum. And this should build on the curriculum assessment planning that takes place across the cluster. To support this process and the well-being of learners, it talks about primary schools engaging with leaders in non-maintained settings, primary and secondary schools engaging with each other, primary and secondary schools should engage with leaders of the pupil referral units as well. So that real holistic understanding and join up across the continuum. Further, secondary schools are also encouraged to engage with leaders of post-16 settings and further education institutions as part of this guidance. As I also mentioned earlier on in this video, it's also clear that the information shared is not just about academic achievement through progress in areas of learning, but information shared as part of the transition process should also focus on the overall needs and well-being of the learner. So it's about getting that holistic view on their journey as they move through the continuum. The final section of the guidance focuses around communication and engaging with parents and carers. And in particular here, I wanted to draw your attention to reporting on learner progression. So in terms of reporting as we move forward, the statutory arrangements in terms of reporting haven't changed. So as part of this communication and engagement process, schools must ensure they formally report to parents and carers at least once a year for all learners aged 3 to 16. So that's the same statutory responsibilities we've had previously, but I think here are the things then the report must include in terms of information about each learner. So about their overall well-being, their progress in learning across the breadth of the curriculum, so all areas of learning and experience. Next steps required to support their progression in terms of how do we move from one part of the progression journey to the next, and then their attendance. So those are things that need to be captured formally through the reporting process. In the rest of this e-learning resource, I will very briefly summarise what I've mentioned, just a quick summary of the key points. And then there'll be a bit of a quiz to see how much of this you took in, how much of it you're able to retain as part of this e-learning process.